Hello everybody. It's white to play in this position. The question is, should white transition into a pawn endgame by taking on g4? Please take your time. Today we'll be discussing pawn endgames. So there will be lots of calculation problems that I will give you, right? So I want active engagement from you for today's episode, folks, which usually I'm doing in my videos anyways. But today we are discussing this very important question of when should we transition into a pawn endgame and what are the steps that should take place in our minds before we do that. As a coach, I've seen so many times that people don't take enough time when they are deciding on transitioning into a pawn endgame. In fact, that's the most committal thing you can probably do when it comes to piece exchanges in chess, right? Because there's no turning back. When the game goes to a pawn endgame, the evaluation is already set. It's based on pure calculation most of the time, but you have to be very concrete. You have to calculate very precisely to the end. In this position, if white takes on g4, that's a huge blunder because at first sight it looks like, hey, look at this. I'm giving black double pawns. I'm creating one more pass pawn. I have these beautiful two passers in the center. So if you rely on general principles, this looks like a great move for white, right? Oh, it's a beautiful move because of chess principles. But that's exactly when you go wrong in a pawn endgame. Pawn endgames are so sharp, so paradoxical sometimes, and so concrete that general principles can lead you to wrong directions. So let's analyze why is black winning this pawn endgame, despite the fact that black is ugly double pawns and white is beautiful three pass pawns basically, right? The problem is this. After king g2 d4, black is creating two distant pass pawns. And distant pass pawns are a huge advantage in a pure pawn endgame, right? We want our pawns to be as connected as possible in the middle game, just like here. These are beautiful pawns, but in a pure pawn endgame, this single king cannot cope with those two passers. Because if you take on, well, after d3, if you take on g4, right, this pawn is queening. That's a problem. And if the king goes to f2, basically, then black pushes the other guy, and basically there's no way for white king to deal with both of the pawns, right? Because of this. And after king e3, for example, well, after king e3, then as you can understand, right, this is going, and you see the strength of distant passed pawns. So it's a beautiful example of when general principles are leading you to wrong directions. Taking a step back. After c5, white is a big choice to make. So you cannot just hand wave and claim that you're winning that pawn endgame because of your beautiful connected pass pawns, three passes, right? You see, the thought process is completely on the contrary. The thought process is that it's a very committal decision. First of all, I will take my time, right? I will spend as much time as possible in this position to make sure, to know that I make sure that I'm knowing the evaluation of the final position, right? And if you, well, in hindsight, rook takes d5 was the best move. After rook takes h4, king g2, white is slightly better, but white had to go for this instead of changing rooks. And as you can understand, people are making such decisions without thinking in actual games. And that's exactly what we'll talk about today. I've witnessed as a coach many times. I'm really mesmerized sometimes that people sometimes have like 25 minutes in a classical game and they make this decision, let's say, within a single minute. But think about that. It's an extremely committal thing you're doing. In this position, it's white to move, folks. And the question is this. Is this a good move for white or not? Right? Because at first sight, it looks like your pawn is hanging, the queen is putting pressure, and in the actual game, white, despite having 11 minutes on his clock, played queen c5 within 1 minute. Incredible. He's making the most committal decision on a chessboard without spending even 2 minutes in this position, right? And the thought process is probably this. Hey, this is hanging. This must be the only move, right? Look at the shallowness of this. He's only protecting his stuff, but what he's enabling is a pawn endgame where there's no turning back. Now this position must be evaluated using concrete calculation properly, because white actually found himself in a completely lost position. King e7, king f3, beautiful move e5, which was missed by white from afar. Why? Because white probably did not even spend enough time to look at this line, because you only spend 1 minute on its clock, right? So you need to spend more time to evaluate the options. Here, basically, that's a very strong move, because the king basically just wants to do this and capture your pawn, and there's really no way for white to stop that, because after f5, king d5, you see? So these 3 pawns are nicely stopped. I will take your pawn on c5, and black is winning this pawn endgame. Going back, folks, going back. So the lesson is this. Whenever you're transitioning into a pawn endgame, you have to be very concrete. You have to be very, very precise. You have to spend time. That's when you have time on your clock, right? That's why you're investing, getting some clock time by doing some efficient thinking before, so you have more time in such decisions. In general, whenever you exchange in chess, you have to spend a lot of time, because they are irreversible, right? Pawn moves are irreversible. You need to spend more time, especially, right? Think about that. When you transition into pawn endgame, that's when you must spend the time. Because, yeah, it looks like, hey, hand waving. White might be thinking, hey, I'm improving my pawn structure, right? Hey, I have an IQP on d4, isolated pawn, it's not good. So in his mind, he's probably thinking like this, hey, it must be a good trade for me, because I'm improving my pawn structure and I'm not losing a pawn. What is missing is objective evaluation and concrete calculation stuff of this particular position, folks. Another problem with pawn endgame transitions. People sometimes have wishful thinking in their minds, right? For example, here, my question is this. Should white go for this trade with rook c7? Should white enter into a pawn endgame? At first sight, it looks like it's a great trade for white. Why? Because at first sight, his king is much closer to those pawns on the king side, right? So he's again hand waving, he's using general principles, thus he's going for this trade. But if you look a little bit deeper, after g5, white wishes and hopes that black will capture on g5, which will give white a winning advantage. But we are not playing checkers, we are playing chess, thus black goes king d6, and there's no way for the white king to invade and capture those pawns. The black king is just very close to defend this stuff, right? And there's no more win, basically. It's a drawn pawn endgame. But it was white's responsibility, right, from here to check for all this. Using concrete calculation, expecting the best moves by the opponent, like a scientist, it was white's task to make sure the evolution of the pawn endgame, right? Instead, of course, any move for these is better for white. Yeah, just rook e6, rook g6, and white will put pressure on black in this rook endgame, right? Because yes, this pawn is basically paralyzing the black king, and white will put so much pressure and questions to black. But laziness sometimes kicks in, especially, right? It's a late phase of the game. You already played a long game, you get lazy, and then you enter into a pawn endgame like this. That's also probably one reason why people make these decisions, because chess is difficult, but this is when you must spend some time, folks. Folks, I'm not saying that all pawn endgames are irrational, paradoxical, crazy things. There are so many nice rules of thumbs that usually work in pawn endgames. For example, the outside passed pawn, right? We all know that it's a big advantage in a pawn endgame. Why? Because this pawn will serve like a decoy for the black king. The black king will be distracted, while the white king will collect everything on the queen side, right? So you can already understand, looking at this position, using your heuristics and general judgments, that white is winning this pawn endgame because of the outside pass pawn. So going back, now you understand the outside pass pawn strength. You understand this decision that was taken by white. It's a beautiful transition to a pawn endgame. Takes. So white enters a pawn endgame. Why? Because white already sees from afar that he will create an outside pass pawn using 2 versus 1 on the queen side, and he will distract the black king, and he will win the game on the king side. Right? That's exactly how this game went. White is objectively winning this pawn endgame, and it's easy and logical to understand why, right? Now you come to this position. Obviously, if the black king will wait, right, you understand how it goes, basically. That's it, right? I take your pawns and I win. But even to this rule, the outside pass pawn, there are exceptions. For example, here after rook e2, can you please tell me, folks, whether rook e6 is a good exchange for white or not? It looks like black has an outside pass pawn here versus the f pawn for white. So at first sight, it looks like a crazy exchange for white. But pawn endgames are very concrete. That's a great move because white is winning this position. Why? Because my king is so much better than your king that your outside pass pawn doesn't really matter, right? So for example, you cannot use your outside pass pawn like a decoy for my king right now, because if you push h5, I will basically go king f5, I will take your pawn and I will win the game easily, right? So you see in this position very clearly that there are several factors in pawn endgames, and the king activity is a huge advantage, of course, that can outweigh sometimes the outside pass pawn. But all of this should be properly calculated by the side who is willing to enter a pawn endgame. There are, of course, other important tools that you can rely on when you evaluate a pawn endgame. A big thing is, of course, is the king's activity. Black goes bishop e5 here, and the question is, should white exchange those bishops and thus go to a pawn endgame, or should white refuse? Well, in the actual game, they played bishop e5, king e5, and the black king is more active than the white king, and there's an invasion potential. King e3 is a must. And what should black do in this position? And that's a concrete nature of pawn endgames. Yes, we are talking about Zugzwang after g5. All these pawns are frozen. The white king is in a Zugzwang position. You have to give way to my king. If you do this, then you'll have this invasion and I win. And if you do this, then this allows me to take your pawns on the king side, right? You can rely on these general principles, but everything must be calculated precisely. You should see the Zugzwang position here with black before you go bishop e5, of course, and you should also see it as white. In this position, white basically entered the pawn endgame again, the same mistake, because he thinks if he doesn't take the bishop, then the bishop will go here and gobble up some pawns. But chess is a very concrete game. In fact, white had a chance to play this way. Bishop d2 is a very nice move, because after this, suddenly king c3 is coming and the bishop is sort of trapped, right? So white had to go for this endgame instead of just saying, oh, I'm losing a pawn, right? I'm losing a pawn, so let's take off those bishops. What is missing is the consequences of the resulting position. And that being a pawn endgame must be properly calculated. I will leave you folks with this homework position that is from my own practice. The question is, should black go rook c3 in this position? Please take your time, judge properly for yourself, and write to me on YouTube. Not only your evaluation, but also, the ways to reach that goal. You can give me some lines, for example. Some lines and some ideas for white and black and your evaluation in the end. Because that's definitely a very forcing move. If it works for black, for example, then it's great because, hey, either you take my rook, otherwise I'm taking your pawn on a3. So that's a very forcing move, but it's black's responsibility, right, to properly calculate the consequences of this move and properly analyze the resulting pawn endgame. Thank you so much for today. If you liked the video, please give me a like and subscribe. In my course on Chessable, the art of exchanging pieces, there is also so much discussion about the endgame transitions, and also pawn endgames are discussed there. Whenever you're thinking about the pawn endgame, the lesson is very clear. You must at least take some time in your clock and properly calculate using your general judgment, but also very concrete calculations. Sometimes, as the first position has shown us today, it's full of paradoxes. It's full of dilemmas that general principles that usually work in chess doesn't work in a pawn endgame. Keep that in mind, and your decisions around pawn endgames will improve. Thank you so much, folks.